Hey, welcome. I'm Dave. I want to introduce you to one of my favorite decluttering tools. This is something you've seen in lots of versions everywhere out there, right? I don't know that you can do minimalism or something like it without having a decluttering process. But the core idea here is our outcome is going to be decluttering. And it can be decluttering in any number of things. Decluttering your role as a leader, decluttering a relationship you might have with someone, decluttering a project and the priorities or the tasks associated with that project, right? At heart, this is a process of reduction. But again, with this notion of decluttering, we're trying to get rid of the extra, the too much, the stuff that's added on and actually is creating clutter and mud and noise and confusion. So at the end of this process, when you have done it well, you're gonna have less that you need to focus on, worry about, and frankly, you'll be able to give yourself permission to care about fewer things than you do right now. The trade-off, though, is that you're gonna care about the things left much more than you do for the smorgasbord of stuff you have right now. We're trying to declutter the stuff that we don't need to care about so we can care about what we have left even more. So the thing we're going to tackle is what I call the 3 buckets, right? It's a basic sorting technique. And the 3 buckets are essential, non-essential, and junk, right? At heart, we're looking at any situation that we're trying to make sense of. It could be clearing out a hall closet. It could be thinking about what is my role as a leader? What are the tasks I need to do to fulfill that role? It could be thinking about who we are in our relationships with others, right? There's lots of context that we can use this tool, but in any of those contexts, we still have the same basic structure. We're taking time to list out all of the parts of that role or project or situation based on these 3 buckets. Now let's dig into the buckets a little bit. I want to start with essential. I want to start there in part because I think it's where we're really going, right? With all of this work, we've got some sense of where we want to get to. So when you're thinking about what's essential, really at heart, you're asking the question, what is most important? Now, when you work with this tool, I suggest you do it in 2 rounds. The first is like brainstorming. Really, it's a draft. Capture anything you can think of and put all of that in one of these 3 buckets. And then once you've captured that, once you get a whole lay of the land, or most of it that comes to mind when you're doing this, then go back and refine, right? It's a lot to ask that we've got a clear picture when we start out with this. And don't put that pressure on yourself. It's not actually that helpful. But go through and think about just answering the question of what's essential, right? List out all the things that you would say, these are essential. Then go to non-essential, the same question. What's important but not quite essential? And then the third, what isn't important and certainly not essential, and maybe I could do without? Now, I like the category label of junk because I think it really starts to define we don't want to keep junk. And in reality, we're gonna have to make a cut somewhere in our role, in our relationship, in our task, in our project, and junk is gonna be one of those first places we look to. So don't get hung up on what that label is. If you have another label that feels like it works for you, just know that the first 2 buckets are the really important ones. What's essential, what's important but not essential, and then maybe what's not important. If junk feels like the wrong label for you, I suggest just label it not important, right? It's the same concept, and I don't want you to get hung up on the semantics here because the real work has to happen before you get tied down into those details. Now, when you dig in and start to think about what's essential, think about the things that bring the most value and impact for you. These are those parts of the Pareto principle, right? The 20% that brings 80% of the value or impact. These are the things that truly do matter the most. If you do them, if you have them, things will more or less be okay, right? Things might be rough, they might be incomplete, but essential really captures the heart and the meat, right? The word itself contains the idea of essence. What's the essence of this role? The essence of this relationship, the essence of this project? What is it at its most simplified core? Right? That's what's essential. Now, after you've captured everything on this list that feels like it might be essential, the challenge is really digging in and limiting that list down to 1 to 3 things. That may seem like a really drastic cut, especially if you start with like 10 essential things. But the reason for this is that we are trying to really refine down to what is most central, what is most essential. I follow the Stephen Covey view of the world, that if you have more than 3 priorities, you have no priorities. The same is true for this idea of essential. If you have more than 3 things that are essential, nothing is essential anymore. And you may be really tempted when you get into that 3, 4, 5 space to just say, good enough, 4 or 5, great. I can still focus on 4 to 5 things. But just a word of warning from experience doing this myself and working with clients as they use this. More than 3 starts to get unmanageable, especially as things get trickier and you have to set tighter boundaries or you have more challenging deadlines. Other aspect that I want you to think about as you think about what's essential is what brings the most meaning, fulfillment, and joy. Now, this might be a slightly different lens than you tend to think of with your projects or your role or your relationships. But it's a really important one because you might have things that you put on that list of essential that actively bring you meaning, fulfillment, and joy and may not seem central to your role, project, or relationship from someone else's perspective. And that's okay, because the reality is you are in that role, relationship, or project. And it's important for you to have that commitment and that connection to a deeper purpose for you. That's part of where the power of essential comes from. The second bucket, as you're drafting out these ideas, is non-essential. And it's just like the name implies. It's important, but not quite essential, right? If you have refined down your essential list, those things will have made it onto this list of non-essential. These are items that add value and have impact, but not as much value and impact as the essential pieces. Sometimes what fills our non-essential bucket is what lies in the future, and that's okay. Part of this exercise is to have clarity on this is a thing that's not essential yet, but it might be in the future. Again, I encourage you to ask that question. What brings meaning, fulfillment, and joy on this list? Those might be things to asterisk, right? And they might not bring as much meaning, fulfillment, and joy as the things on your essential list. But noting that they do bring those is important. It's just like future casting some of the items that might make your list too. They will be important in the future. These are items that don't bring as much meaning, fulfillment, and joy yet. And with this list, it's okay to have it fill up. There will be a step later on to refine what's on your non-essential list. But for right now, put anything you need to on that list. We'll come back to it. The third bucket is not important. Well, the bucket's called not important. The bucket itself is pretty important. All right. The third bucket, I like to call junk. You may prefer to call it not important. Again, doesn't matter. Don't get stuck on the language there. The idea with this not important bucket is that these are things that consume unnecessary amounts of time, energy, and mental bandwidth. You're going to have some early candidates, especially in your role or some of your relationships, where you're like, oh my gosh, that part of this role, project, relationship takes up so much time and I don't get anything out of it. Other items that might fall into this bucket are things that promise meaning, fulfillment, and joy, but never deliver. It's important that those live in this not important list. And part of that is because of the first quality or qualification for this list. These are things that are taking unnecessary or disproportionate amount of time, energy, and mental bandwidth. Items in this bucket, in this not important bucket, might have impact but don't add value. right? They are things that you might create as part of the project and on the margins have some impact, but haven't qualitatively improved the project or your role or your relationship. Sometimes these are the things that we spend the most time on. And really, in a sense, we rob ourselves of that time to spend somewhere else, either in what's essential or what's non-essential, but still important. Again, like the non-essential list, put anything you need to in this bucket. Really, this bucket is endlessly deep. Anything that you think might qualify as not important, or in my language, junk, goes in here. There's always space for more junk. Because the second part of this process, after you've brainstormed across these 3 buckets, is getting back. And we've talked about with essential, you're narrowing it down to your top 3. Less than 3, even better. And with your non-essential, you really want to thin that list down as much as possible. In this non-essential list, remember, we have those items we asterisked, either because they were going to be essential in the future, or they might provide more meaning, fulfillment, and joy. Again, in the future. So it's important to nurture those and have a place that we can honor those. And then ideally, we're pushing everything off as much as possible into this junk bucket. Because as you might guess, the third thing we're going to do is actively toss out as much of the junk as humanly possible. Some of those things might be things that you can delegate off to someone else. Some of those might be conversations in a relationship that just aren't adding value, and you keep swirling around the same stuff. It's a junky conversation. It's robbing your relationship of time, energy, and mental bandwidth when there might be a better conversation to have. There might be something underneath the conversation that you're currently having. Maybe there's a level of honesty or authenticity that you haven't tapped into yet. Maybe there's a level of vulnerability you haven't been comfortable stepping into to have the real conversation underneath the one that now you see in this junk bucket. Because part of the biggest strategy here is trying to reduce wherever possible. I hope this was useful. I would love to hear your thoughts. As always, leave a comment, suggestion, critique. I love it all. And if this was useful for you, please subscribe. I'm going to have more videos. If you liked it, like it. And if you think it'd be useful for a friend or colleague, please pass it along. Always more space for more folks in this conversation.